Hey guys, you have a midterm coming up and you have review videos for chapters 1 through 6, but you are missing chapter 7. So I'm going to review the French Revolution and Napoleon for you real quick. All right, so the first thing we have is the estate system for pre-revolutionary France. So this is the Ancien Régime. It means ancient regime, or the ancient leadership, or estates, or class system. All right, so the first estate was the Roman Catholic clergy. It makes up about 0.5% of the population, like literally half of 1%. A very small population of France. The second estate was made up of the rich nobility. Remember, noble has to do with bloodlines and names and titles. This group held many of the leading positions in government, military, law courts, or church offices, and makes up about 1.5% of the population. So the top two together make up about 2% of the population. The third estate is 98% of the population. This is everyone else, the commoners, the people who don't have noble blood or don't work for the church. So there's three main types of people in this group: the bourgeoisie, the upper wealthy class. They call it the middle class. It makes up about 18% of the population. So that leaves about 80% of the population of France is city workers and peasants, the poor. So about 80% of France was poor. There's a reason that they wanted to overthrow their government. About 80% of people lived a miserable life. All right, so that's our first, second, and third estates of France. Which estate is the largest? Definitely the third. And which states were exempt from taxes? That means they do not pay taxes, the first and the second, the church and the nobility. All right, what factors led to the revolution? The Enlightenment spread ideas that everyone should be equal. The French economy was failing. People were hungry. High taxes kept profits low, and food supplies were short. And King Louis was weak and unconcerned, and his wife was spending a lot of money. She was also foreign, so a lot of people didn't like her. All right, so there's the long-term causes again. 3-estate system, absolute monarchy, money problems, and a weak king. All right, then we begin the actual movement toward war. In 1786, banks began refusing to loan the king money, and France was broke. In 1787 and 1788, a series of bad harvests, which means bad crops, because of some bad weather and some hailstorms and some other things, caused food shortages. Okay, there are a couple of truths throughout history. More food will always equal more people, and less food will always mean a revolt. Okay, food shortages. Now, if Louis had money, he could have bought food from his neighboring countries. He doesn't have any money, and the banks won't loan him any. So he's not able to bring food in and save the people of France. All right, what was the Estates General? It's basically like a French parliament or Congress and includes delegates or representatives from each of the three estates. Approximately 300 from the first estate, 300 from the second estate, and 600 from the third estate. It's the biggest estate, so it gets more, but it's really still not proportional. We have half of the Estates General, 300 and 300 makes 600, so half of the Estates General was from 2% of the population and half was from 98% of the population. That's clearly not fair. They also voted 1 vote per estate, so 3 votes total. And the first and second estate would always agree with each other, and the third would always get voted out. So that's what's going to lead us to the next thing. So in May of 1789 is the first Estates General meeting in over 100 years. It was a very desperate move of Louis to try to gain more taxes. All right, what issue caused the third estate to leave the Estates General meeting in May? Voting. So they did not like the 3-vote system. They wanted to make it one vote for every person in the room, so a total of 1,200 votes. They wanted to make it a little bit more fair. It still was going to sway the votes for the first and second estate, but it was a little bit more fair. Well, the first and second estate said, let's vote on it, and they overruled the third, and the third said, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So then they called Louis and asked Louis for a tiebreaker, and Louis agreed with the first and second estate, and so the third estate walked out. Okay, and so the next question is, after leaving the meeting, what did they begin calling themselves? They began calling themselves the National Assembly. And then the third one is, what oath did they swear? So Louis locked them out of their meeting place, and they had to find a new place to meet, and they met at a huge indoor tennis court. And so they swore something called the Tennis Court Oath, which was to continue meeting no matter what Louis did until they wrote a constitution for France. All right, so that's May and June of 1789. The third estate leaves and forms the National Assembly and swears the Tennis Court Oath. All right, what happens in July of that same year, July 14th of 1789, and why does it matter? That would be the storming of the Bastille, prison, and armory, and the official start of the French Revolution. So we have that there, storming of the Bastille. All right, then in July through September, we have what's called the Great Fear, which is basically just a period of chaos where nobody knew if they were really revolting, if they were overthrowing the king or not, and who was in charge of France. And a lot of peasants rose up against the nobles that they rented their lands from. All right, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen? That would be Olympe de Gouges. Unfortunately, she's going to end up executed during the Terror. In August, we're going to have two main events. August 4th, they're going to publish something called the August 4th Decrees, which abolished the old regime. All noble privileges were revoked. And on the 26th, they're going to publish the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, or the Do-Ro-Mac, as John Green calls it, which outlines the goals and the rights of the revolution. All right, what happened on October 5th of 1789? The Women's March to Versailles, and the King and Queen are moved to Paris. Okay, so the Women's March, there's a food shortage in the city of Paris. There is a rumor that Marie Antoinette has food hidden out of the palace, so they march out to the palace, which is about 20 miles outside the city. They tell Louis and Marie to come down. Louis tries to send the guards down after him, and the guards are like, look, it's a group of peasant women. We're not going to just fire into this kind of crowd. And so Louis is left vulnerable. And so he and Marie Antoinette come on down. They get a big wagon full of food, and they head into Paris. They will never return to that palace again, unfortunately for them. All right, what did the revolutionary government do to anger the church officials? So remember now Louis is kind of not in charge. He's hanging out, and they're still letting him hang out for now, but he's not really in charge. So the revolutionary government did some things to try to make things what they thought was more equal in France. But one of the things that they're going to do that angers the peasants is that they're actually going to attack the Catholic Church. And since most of the peasants are Catholic and their life is miserable and they're hoping that heaven is better, they don't want to go against the church. So the revolutionary government passed a law called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy that took land from the church to sell to make money, and stated that church officials would now be elected and paid by the government, which the church, of course, is not a fan of. A lot of the church officials are going to vacate France and go and hang out in Rome with the Pope, and the Catholic citizens of France are going to be really upset about this because in their belief system, or in this older version of their beliefs, you had to have the church to get to heaven, and so they thought that their way to heaven was basically cut off. So of course they're going to be pretty upset about that. All right, so that's in 1791. They do write a constitution, and they also, the king and queen attempt to escape France, which is going to be bad because they get caught, they get brought back, they get locked up for real this time instead of house arrest. They go to real jail, and then Louis is going to get himself put on trial. All right, so what happens to King Louis? He is declared a common citizen, and they abolish the monarchy. Then they put him on trial for treason and for conspiring against liberty, and he is found guilty, of course. They wanted to find him guilty. It was kind of a make-believe trial. But then they vote on whether to execute him or exile him, and by one vote he loses, and he is executed via guillotine. He gets his head removed. All right, so that is going to spring the Reign of Terror. So for about a year, the Committee of Public Safety and Maximilien Robespierre are going to run France, and they are going to execute about 40,000 people, 16,000 of them with the guillotine, including King Louis and Marie Antoinette and Olympe de Gouges. All right, what is the Committee of Public Safety? It was a group started by a political party called the Jacobins, and it was meant to defend France from foreign and domestic threats. So foreign means threats outside of the country. That makes sense. Domestic means people inside the country, people inside of France that they thought were against the revolution. What was the Reign of Terror? What happened? Who was involved? All right, so the rule of Maximilien Robespierre, he ordered the death of many people who did not agree with him. His rule, which began in 1793, revolutionary courts were set up to prosecute internal enemies of the Revolutionary Republic. Close to 40,000 people were killed, 16,000 of them with the guillotine, including Marie Antoinette and Olympe de Gouges and the king. The terror ended in July 1794 when Robespierre himself was put to death. Okay, so he's also going to end up killed by the guillotine. All right, what was a directory? This was a 5-person committee type of rule government set up in France. It's going to last for 5 years after the death of Robespierre, um, so up to 1799. So it's a government that ruled between Robespierre and Napoleon. 5 wealthy middle-class men shared power. It has a 2-house or bicameral legislature. They put down revolts and radicals, but they were a really terrible government. So that's the directory, 1794 to 1799. In 1799, what happens to change the course of French history? Napoleon shows up. He's been working for the revolutionary government this entire time, making a lot of military victories and gaining a really great famous reputation. And he is going to suddenly take over the government, which is a coup d'etat, so Napoleon's coup d'etat. What kind of government was formed with Napoleon's takeover? He created something called a consulate with 3 consuls ruling France, with Napoleon as the head consul. It was supposed to be a form of a republic, but he basically takes control pretty quickly. But because the people liked him so much, and because he was doing what they wanted, at least in the beginning, they didn't mind that he was taking over. So that's kind of one of the things that happens with charismatic leaders like this, is they like them at first and they allow them to take too much power, and then they disagree later. All right, so that's in 1799. All right, so leadership roles of Napoleon. Remember, he went to military school really young. He became a lieutenant by 16. Then he was appointed general by the Committee of Public Safety. When he took over, originally he was called first consul. Then he declared himself consul for life. And then he eventually is going to crown himself emperor in 1804. All right, so what was the Concordat of 1801? It was the document that made peace between France and the Catholic Church under Napoleon. Napoleon wasn't necessarily a huge Catholic believer or a very devout Christian or anything, but he was a good leader, and he knew that his people were mostly Catholic and that they would want the church back, so he made that happen for them. Concordat is just another word for agreement. All right, what is important about the Civil Code or Napoleonic Code? This is the laws made for France by Napoleon, and it made all of the laws of France the same. It gave all French citizens the same rights, but they also took away some individual freedoms like freedom of speech. It restored slavery in the French colonies, which is going to cause a problem in Haiti, and also made things worse for women. All right, how are the French and Haitian revolutions linked? Haiti was a French colony called Saint-Domingue. It took place right around the same time. The talk of equality and rights of the people in France inspired the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and they rose up. They originally thought that they were freed by the revolution, and then Napoleon tried to re-enslave them. Of course, that's not going to be something that they're a fan of. There were a lot of sugar plantations down there. We've already kind of talked about the conditions on slave plantations and how bad that is. So obviously they're not a fan. Okay, that's also going to lead Napoleon to kind of give up on his dream of an American empire, and is going to inspire him to sell us Louisiana. He'd actually acquired Louisiana by taking Spain, and because Spain actually owned Louisiana at the time. So France is going to get it back from Spain. France had it first, then they had given it to Spain after the 7 Years' War, and then they're taking it back, and then they sold it to us. Under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, and we got it pretty cheap. Doubled the size of our country. It's going to make a big deal for us. All right, in 1804, Napoleon crowned himself emperor and also lost Haiti. So it was a kind of mixed year for Napoleon. What is the significance of the Battle of Trafalgar? I know it's a crazy name, but it's a huge naval loss for France. They tried to take Britain by force in the water, and they lost. And so that's the thing about Britain, is you never wanted to take on their navy in history. They were an island, and so they had a very strong navy. Now Napoleon can't be beat on land hardly, and so this was one of his kind of big mistakes. All right, in 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar, it's a huge loss to Great Britain. All right, what were Napoleon's 3 big mistakes? He could not let go of that loss. That is number 1. When he lost to Britain, he is going to try to weaken Britain. He's going to try to break them financially, which is going to backfire. We're going to look at that in a second. He made his brother the King of Spain, which is going to be bad because the people of Spain are not going to feel loyalty to him at all, and neither are the colonies, which is going to lead to what we're doing in Chapter 8, which is going to be the Latin American revolutions. And then his final and worst mistake is trying to invade Russia. All right, what is the continental system? It's an attempt to blockade supplies going into Britain and trade. He basically said any of his allies, any nations that he controlled, were not supposed to trade with Britain. He was trying to hopefully weaken Britain through their wallet. Unfortunately, Britain's navy is much stronger than his, and so they're going to force through the blockade. Also, Russia is going to continue to trade with Britain because they really needed that trade, and so they're going to ignore Napoleon. And when Napoleon gets angry about that, he's going to turn and decide to invade Russia, which is going to lead to his third mistake. All right, so in 1806, he established the continental system, which was bad. All right, what happened when Napoleon invaded Russia? Russia used the scorched earth policy to leave French army with no shelter or supplies. Basically, they burned their own cities and fields, which sounds like a bad idea. It kind of is, but it leaves your enemy with no supplies and no food, and so it helps weaken them, but of course it does damage your own property. When the winter hit, they were forced to retreat, and his army was destroyed, and then the Russians attacked Napoleon on the way out as he turned tail to run. So that's in 1812. By 1814, Napoleon was surrounded. Lots of other nations realized that Napoleon was at a weak point, and they jumped in with Russia, and he was surrounded and arrested in 1814. They do not kill him. They exile him to an island called Elba off the coast of Italy, and they replace Louis with his brother, another Louis. It's going to be bad. It was a bad decision for France, and then in 1815, Napoleon escapes the island of Elba and returns to France, and he's going to rule for 100 days. It's called the 100 Days, and he tried to retake over France, and there was lots of people who were still loyal to him, but he's going to be captured again out in Belgium at a city called Waterloo, and this is going to be his final surrender. He's going to be exiled to another island much further away off the coast of southern Africa, and this time he's going to stay there, and France is going to go on to actually bring back another of Louis' relatives and try to move forward. All right, what was the Congress of Vienna and what were the goals of this meeting? This was a meeting that was started after Napoleon's first arrest, where the leaders of Europe tried to recreate the old school Europe before the French Revolution, and Napoleon had tried to bring a new republic and constitution and just a more flexible government to Europe. They wanted to go back to tradition: strong king, strong church, strong laws, strong rules, and they wanted to go back to that. So it says in 1814, leaders of many nations met for months. They tried to draw up a peace plan for Europe that would last many years, and the goal was to create a balance of power. They didn't want any one nation to be able to conquer the others like France had done. Who became the leader of this group? The foreign minister from Austria, who is Clemens von Metternich. All right, guys, so there's lots of videos linked and lots of reviews, so good luck.